In this book called Just Undungeous War, Michaels Walzer considers the moral reality of war, which is divided into two components: justice of war use ad bellum and justice during war use in bello. The first assesses the reasons why states are at war. The second assesses the means they choose to do so. It is also emphasized that it is possible to wage a just war and act unfairly, as well as vice versa. The author emphasizes the crime of aggression, but notes that the conduct of a war of aggression is governed by the rules. An important aspect is the division of moral assessments into two logically independent categories. Walzer proposes to study the essence of war as a whole, urging to consider its dualism as an essential feature. All parts of the chapters are devoted to the analysis of the crime of the outbreak of war and the rules of war with a view to subsequent consideration of tensions between goals and means in a military conflict. The book does not say whether the moral reality of war is completely consistent, but notes that it has a recognizable and relatively stable form because of our understanding of states, soldiers, and battles. This book discusses the logic of war and why the beginning of war is considered wrong. The author points out that the main problem of the war is that people, often many, die in it. War is described as limitless in its cruelty, where people of all ages, genders, and moral qualities are killed. Karl von Clausewitz argues that war is an active force that theoretically has no boundaries. The logic of war, according to Clausewitz, strives for the unlimited use of force and cruelty. The war initiated by the aggressor is responsible for all the consequences of hostilities. The question of voluntary struggle and what wars can be considered healing is also raised. For example, the battle of aristocratic youth in tournaments is considered as the idea of creative war, if it takes place with their voluntary consent. The topics concern the use of mercenary soldiers and professional military personnel, where the issue of freedom of choice and voluntary harmonization is important. The point is that war becomes hell when people are forced to fight and the limit of consent is broken. Particular attention is paid to compulsory military service and its impact on the nature of the war. It is also noted that individual consent, in the absence of which acts of force are condemned, can serve as a limiter to the frequency and strength of wars. This book discusses the tyranny of war and why war is often described as a form of tyranny. It is said that war is a social practice in which force is used against people who are forced to be members of states, and not as people who choose their own enterprises and professions. War, according to the chapter, is interested in a person, even if he would like to be somewhere else and do something else. The author notes that the tyranny of war manifests itself at a high rate and in the interests of military organizations and individuals. The chapter emphasizes the special horror of war. It is a social practice in which force is used against people as loyal members of states, and in this context, war becomes hell. The author notes that even in accordance with the rules of war, when only soldiers die and civilians do not participate, the war remains terrible. The book also raises the question that war is rarely spontaneous and is most often the result of the actions of certain people and groups. Military agents, especially those who are the first to pick up a bare sword, can be called criminals for forcing others to participate in the war. The book ends with a discussion of how the tyranny of war rarely meets internal resistance, and real opposition most often arises from the enemy. When soldiers believe that they are fighting aggression, war becomes a crime that they can confront in the hope of victory, aimed not only at getting rid of the brutality of the battle, but also at punishing the aggressor and reducing the likelihood of future suppression. General Sherman's point of view on war and his statement, "War is hell," are discussed. The author notes that Sherman not only described the horrors of the war, but also expressed a certain moral conviction. He considered the war a crime of those who started it, and argued that soldiers who resisted aggression could not be accused of loving actions that bring victory closer. Particular attention is paid to the events during the American Civil War, in particular, the events in Atlanta. Sherman noted that he was forced to use force and that the bombing, the forced evacuation of the city, and the arson of Atlanta were inevitable elements of the war. He claimed that at the beginning of the war he had no hand, that he was forced to use force, and that he did not fight of his own free will. Thus, he justified his actions within the framework of a moral argument. The tyranny of war is not unlimited, as Clausewitz suggests in his concept. The war can be condemned not only for the act of aggression itself, but also for specific criminal acts committed during the war. It is also noted that even being in the hell of war, you can take a more or less humane approach and fight restrictions. In conclusion, our research and our book focus on a deep understanding of the moral reality of war, raising important questions about justice, responsibility, and humanity.